Hi there, I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. It's Pioneer Day, and I've really looked forward to finishing the Ephriam Hanks story. I've told this story several hundred times to various groups across the Wasatch Front. I've done it for the Sons of the Pioneer multiple times, and one chapter gave me this beautiful medallion. A group down in Mapleton, after I'd been there several times, gave me this beautiful plaque. But I enjoy telling this story to little kids. It's a wonderful story. I told our primary about it one year, and a mother called me later on and said, I've got to tell you what happened. My son came home from church today and he said, Mom, we had a real pioneer come to primary today. And she was like, No, he wasn't a real pioneer. He was like, No, Mom, he was a real pioneer. I tell this story in the first person because that's the way the journal entries were given. In October 1856, Heber C. Kimball called for all available teams and wagons to head into the mountains, and the following day 115 wagons were on their way east to help rescue the Handcart Pioneers. Ephraim was already on the road, and this is his story. Hi there, I'm Ephraim Hanks. I was blessed to live in a time where the West was wide open. The country was clear, the mountains were untouched. We had a wonderful opportunity as we brought the saints into the valley, and I was blessed to know some of the founders of this great land. Brigham Young, the great colonizer; Jedediah Smith, one of the great explorers; Jacob Hamblin, the ambassador to the Indians. We called him the Buckskin Apostle. And who can forget Porter Rockwell? What a character he was. These were wonderful men that all seemed to have their place. And I had my place. I crossed the plains on horseback more than any other person, except my partner, carrying mail, Charlie Decker. We had some amazing experiences as we crossed the plains. We tangled with Indians. We negotiated with them. We negotiated with the government and with contracts and with helping settlers here and there, and always helping the LDS people as they made their way to the valley. We really beat a path through the wilderness to our valley. Brigham Young was busy trying to get people from the east to the west, and many of us were busy trying to settle in different communities. In the fall of 1856, I was quite busy catching fish. Utah Lake was full of fish back then, beautiful trout, all kinds of lake fish. And I would bring them back by the barrel and sell them to the stores in Salt Lake City. And quite often I'd have to stop at Guernsey Brown's house. He was the bishop in Draper. He was the bishop for 34 years, and everyone knew you could always stop at Guernsey's house and his good wife would make you a meal. I got there one evening. It was still 18 miles into my home in Salt Lake City, so I spent the night. We had an early dinner, and I turned in. I'd been fishing all day, and I'd caught a lot of fish. It had gotten cloudy and stormy, which helped with the fishing, but it apparently didn't help much with those poor pioneers that were still pulling hand carts across Wyoming. I went to bed early, and I laid down, closed my eyes, and all of a sudden I heard a voice. It said, Ephraim Hanks. And I turned and looked, and there was an average-sized man standing next to my bed, and he said, The Handcart Pioneers are in trouble. You are needed. Will you help them? And I said, Yes, if I'm called, I will. And I rolled over and turned towards the wall and tried to go to sleep. And a few moments later, the same man, the same exact message was repeated. And I said, Yes, I'll go in the morning. The next thing I knew, he was urgently repeating the message, and I turned to tell him that I would go, and he was not in the room. I felt a feeling that it was not just some friendly visitor in my room, but the Lord was reaching out to me. Brigham Young had tested my obedience more than once. I think the Lord had decided to send a messenger to test my obedience. So I got up and I told the bishop what had happened, and his good wife made me a little lunch. We hooked up my team to the bishop's wagon, and I made my way into Salt Lake City through the night. And just as first light was coming, I was approaching Brigham Young's home, and I saw a rider come out of his back property, and he saw me, and he turned, and he ran right over to me on the horse, and he stopped. He said, "Oh, Ephraim, I'm so glad to find you." He goes, "Oh, the prophet sent me to find you, and I didn't know where you were. He didn't know where you were, and here you are right here in the backyard." And then he began to explain to me about the pioneers, and I said, I know. So I told him, "Tell Brigham that I'll go." So I went home, got my gear ready, and I started off into the mountains. Brigham had organized several groups to take supplies to the pioneers throughout the summer, and several of them were still out in the mountains and in the Wyoming plains. And as I rode, I got into the mountains and realized that we'd had rain in the valley, but up in the mountains, it had snowed, and it had snowed a lot. And it was slow going, and after about a day of wading through the snow, I came on Riddick Allred's camp. And he had several rigs, quite a few teams, and was loaded with supplies. And he was probably the last supply wagon that was heading out to meet the handcart people. But he didn't know the trouble they were in. And I told him, I said, "I've got a bad feeling about it. Riddick, they're in trouble." And I told him the experience I'd had with the messenger. But we were snowed in. It snowed and it snowed and it snowed. For 3 days it snowed. By the time the snow let up, it was up to the wagon beds. And the poor animals could hardly move around. It was so deep. It was up to their bellies. And I stayed around camp with Riddick for another day, and I could not get those poor suffering people out of my mind. And I finally arranged with Riddick for a pack and a horse to ride and another animal to use as a pack horse. And I began to lead them through the deep snow, and it was slow going. The next day, I ran into Joseph A. Young and the Garboys, and they had been sent as runners to check on the handcart people. And the tale they told was terrifying. They said one night the Martin Handcart people had lost 19 souls, and that their feet were frozen. Many of them were wading in snow barefoot, and they were almost completely out of supplies. They were down to quarter ration, just a little bit of flour and nothing else. I felt an urgency to help these people, and I continued on. That night, the winds were whistling, and it was cold out there in Wyoming, and I found a ravine and had some meager provisions, and I tried to make do with what I had, and I just thought to myself, oh, it'd be so nice to have a buffalo robe to sleep on tonight. It'd be so much warmer than this little bedroll I got. I thought, oh, can you imagine how good a buffalo steak could be? And I knelt down and I prayed and asked the Lord to help me find buffalo for those people, because they were in dire need. And you didn't see many buffalo out in that part of the country once the snow started to fall and pile up. And I've had a lot of prayers answered, but I've never had a prayer answered so immediately, because when I said amen, I looked up the hill and I knew what to do. I grabbed my rifle. There on the hill, 50 yards above me, was a big bull buffalo. I took careful aim. He hopped once, he jumped a second time and spun, and then he rolled down the ravine and stopped right near where I'd been praying. Well, I knew what to do, and I got busy. I got out my big hunting knife and I began to skin that buffalo, skinned him out, and then before I butchered him, I cut out the tongue and some of the other choice parts, and I had a wonderful dinner. And then I commenced to butcher that animal and to cut the meat into big long strips so I could load the pack horse with it. The next morning I had probably 300 or more pounds of meat on that horse, and we began to work our way through the snow. And about noon, as I was approaching the Ice Bench Springs, to my surprise, I came on to another herd of buffalo. And so I shot a little cow. I hurried and butchered it as fast as I could, and I loaded my horse with the meat. So I had hundreds of pounds of meat on each of my horses. And then I began to lead my horses off through the deep snow. And as there was about an hour left in the day, I could see far off in the distance, it looked like just a little gray line in the snow. And as I got closer, I realized that I had found the Martin Handcart Company near Sweetwater. As I walked into camp, what I saw will never be erased from my mind. The suffering of those poor people was unbelievable. There were people without shoes. Many of the people's clothing was frozen on their bodies. They'd had to ford the streams and the Platte River, and they didn't have extra clothing. People had buried their loved ones, and they were down to almost no food. And as I pulled my two horses behind me, laden with all that meat, they just rushed at me in throngs and were, "Please, can I have some meat? My children haven't eaten today. Could I please have just a little?" And children would come up to me and say, "Give me some, give me some." And at first I tried to dole out everyone's portions, and soon I just said, "Everyone take what you need." Within a few moments, my two horses were free of the hundreds of pounds of meat that had been packed onto them. And that evening in camp, there were happy noises for the first time because these people were having a great meal. They hadn't eaten a decent meal in weeks. They'd been on quarter rations for a week and half rations for several weeks before that. And they were walking around just in a daze, in a funk. They just were almost without thought accomplishing whatever needed to be done. I was sitting around a campfire with a few of the brethren, and many of them had just gone to bed, but some of them wanted to hear news of the valley, to be encouraged. I had tried to give all the people good news about Salt Lake and what awaited them when they got there. One sister walked by the fire, and she was wailing and crying, just sobbing, and she walked into Brother Tyler's tent. And Brother Tyler had pulled a handcart all day long and had retired for the evening. And Sister Blair went in and said, "Brother Tyler, I don't know if my husband's going to make it through the night. Would you come give him a blessing?" Brother Tyler, as tired as he was, what a good man. He got up, put on his clothes and his boots, and I followed Sister Blair and Brother Tyler back to her tent. Brother Tyler walked over to her husband and shook him a little, looked at him, got down close and listened. And he stood up and said, "Sister Blair, I'm sorry. I cannot administer to a dead man." And he turned to me and said, "Brother Hanks, would you prepare this man's body for burial?" And burial, that was something to see. They had lost over 100 of their people, and they had become so weak, so emaciated, that they couldn't even dig a decent grave. And so they would just dig the snow and bury him in snow. And then as they pulled out of camps, they'd see the wolves tearing apart the loved ones they had had to leave behind. So they had had a terrible time. But I had a funny feeling about Sister Blair and the situation, so I went back to the camp and I asked the brethren that were visiting with me earlier if they'd help me, and they said, "Sure." So we went over next to Sister Blair's tent and we built a huge fire, and I got a kettle and I got it full of snow and melted it off and got the water good and hot. Took the water in, and I took Brother Blair's clothing off, and then I washed him from head to toe. And I always carried a flask of consecrated oil with me, and I anointed his body, his complete body, from head to toe. And then we laid our hands on his head and administered to him. I commanded him in the name of Jesus Christ to rise up. And he immediately sat up in his bed and he gasped and took a big breath and then commenced to sing a hymn. Sister Blair was overjoyed. She ran through camp and yelling, "My husband who is dead has been brought back to life. The man who brought the buffalo meat has raised him from the dead." There was a different feeling in camp that night. But from that moment on, I was engaged in administering to the sick, both with consecrated oil and with my knife, because many of their limbs had become frozen. Fingers, toes, ears, feet had turned black, and the flesh was rotting off the bone. Sometimes I could just take a little Castile soap and just rub the affected areas until all the meat fell off, and then I'd take my knife. And before I did that, I'd bless these people that they would be able to endure what I had to do. And many of them, after I amputated a foot or a hand, told me, "I didn't feel a thing, Brother Hanks." The Lord blessed us as we waited. After I'd been in camp a few days, I had the opportunity to go out, and the Lord provided more meat for those people. And I found another herd of buffalo, and I was able to kill 2 buffalo and bring them back into camp with all the meat. I assured them that Brigham Young had sent dozens of wagons to their aid, and that they would ride into the Salt Lake Valley. Finally, after about a week, wagons started to arrive. These poor immigrants had given out. They couldn't go another step through the snow pulling these hand carts. Once the wagons started coming, they had the food they needed. Soon we were able to get enough wagons that we could accommodate all of their luggage. But the first morning as we began to move west, it was a hard thing. Women and children, even some of the men, were sobbing uncontrollably and just beside themselves, that they couldn't take another step. But at that point, we still had to walk. There were few that rode, the very worst. Most of them still had to walk. But as we walked, we were joined by more and more wagons. And before we got to Fort Bridger, everyone was able to ride in wagons. As we rode along, each day it was still bitter cold. We were able to have the Spirit of the Lord to help these people. Ever since I was a boy, it seems like if I'd stay in touch with the Lord, He would stay in touch with me. And this is the way I figure it. The Lord isn't going to fool around to show miracles and signs to people. But when a body's really in need, when there's something that needs to happen in someone's life that no other person can do but the Lord will help those people. Yes, the Lord does some strange things, but I've noticed when He needs things done, He relies on us common folk to help. And I felt it a real privilege to be part of rescuing these poor souls. When the Martin Handcart Company left Council Bluffs, they had 576 people in the company. And by the time we got them into the Salt Lake Valley, there were 430 left in the company. They had buried their children, their husbands, their wives, their parents along the sides of the trail. They had suffered immensely, but they had come to know the Lord. One evening, we were sitting in camp near Fort Bridger, and a Sister Dobson came, and she said, "Brother Hanks, I'm a widow. The only person I have left in this world is my son Thomas, and I don't think he's going to make it through the night. Would you come administer to him?" And I went to her tent, and that poor boy was so weak he could hardly even open his eyes. And I leaned down and I said, "Thomas, do you have the faith to be healed?" And in the faint whisper he said, "Yes." and I laid my hands on his head after administering with consecrated oil, and I commanded him to rise. And he got up, he got dressed, and to the amazement of everyone, he seemed energized. He was immediately healed. I pulled a wagon over, and someone took a hornpipe, and he danced a jig in the back of the wagon for everyone. He was a great dancer. Another night, when we were near Echo Canyon, Sister Squires went into labor, and that night she brought her son into the world. One of the sisters of the company cut off her undergarments and allowed the little stranger to have clothing for the remainder of the trip. He grew into a fine young man, Echo Squires. His dad is a merchant in Salt Lake. But no matter who you talk to who was in the Martin Handcart Company, they will tell you, through all of the problems, through all of the experiences that we had, the loss, the heartache, we came to know the Lord. We came to know that the Lord loves us and was aware of us. And when we were in most need, his hand was reached out to us. The Lord does know you. The Lord knows me. And the things we go through in this life may seem unbearable at times. But the Lord wants us to look to him in every thought and to doubt not or to fear not. He's promised us that he will be there to support us. If you doubt that the Lord loves you, if you're going through experiences that make you wonder, kneel down and ask God, do you love me? And I promise you that you will feel the Lord's love come into your soul and into your heart and into your mind. I know I'm not Ephraim Hanks. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you.